Okay, so welcome to my Summative Tools class. This is where I have all the tools for my Summative, including some of the tools I use for the game, or just some tools that I thought would be a really good idea to use. So right off in our main method, we don't really have much of a main method, but in the main method we have here, it's really where I test my methods to see if it's working. So I was testing here next prime, and I put for the parameter 5. So it tested out pretty well. So that's basically all I use the main method for. So on to the very first method we have. So we have a method and it's called printNums. It takes an integer a from the user, and then it prints all the numbers from 1 to a, basically 1 to the user's input, and then it prints it on a new line. So as you see, it uses a for loop and it counts, and since it's system.out.println, so it prints a line for every single number. So if it's 12, the first one will be 1, and then it will be 2. So it's a pretty basic method, but it's extremely useful for a game. If you want to publish, like, let's say the scores, you can put number 1, number 2, and number 3. So it's quite a useful method. So next we have another method called reverse string, and it just takes the user has to input a string, and then it just takes that string and it reverses it. So let's say if we're using the string word, W-O-R-D, it will print out D-R-O-W, so it just reverses it. And this is done using a for loop and char at. So it just takes the character at I, and then it just adds it to string W. And instead of counting up, instead of I plus 1 or I plus plus, it goes backwards. So that's how it works. And then it returns the final reversed string right here at the bottom. So then we have the next method. It's called printNums. So it takes two things from the user. It takes an integer called a and an integer called b. So basically all this method does is it prints out all the numbers from a to b. And then there's one condition on this, is that a is greater than or equal to b. So no, a is less than or equal to b. So it can't be greater, because if not, it doesn't really work. So then we use a method from the math tools class. So math.max, which takes the greatest integer from a or b, and then we use math.min, another thing from the math class, a to b. And then I use a for loop right here, and there we go. And then it's printNums. And then we have the next method called calc running total. So it will take inputs, it will take an integer input, or integer a, and then it'll calculate the total value at the end. So as you see, we have two variables. We have total and input, and then prints out total at the end. We use a for loop to complete this. And then we have another method, which I don't use in my game, but I think that it could be useful in case, I don't know, string manipulation is necessary. It's called left2. So it takes the first two characters of a string, or str, and then it moves them to the end. So string, the first two characters, s and t, would get moved to the end. So then this is done using conditional statements, so if, and then else. And then we use the substring, which is very useful for all types of string manipulation. And then it returns the string. The next method is called isPrime. So it takes an integer x, and then it returns a boolean. So depending on the user's input, it'll tell them if it's a prime number or not. So a prime number is only divisible by itself and nothing else. And contrary to a composite number, which it can divide by itself and many other things. So using a for loop, you can do this. It counts up from 2, because anything is divisible by 1. And so it doesn't make sense to start at 1. You have to start at 2, if not, the thing wouldn't work. So then if the remainder, this percentage sign is remainder, if x divided by I, x remainder I is 0, then that means it's divisible cleanly. It's cleanly divisible, and then it's obviously not a prime number, so it returns false. And if this is not true, then it returns true. So next we have probably what I think is the most important method. I've used this countless times in my games because, I don't know, it adds a sense of unpredictability, and I just feel that it improves the experience much more, and it's very fun to use. It's called genrand. It takes an int, or int a, and then it returns an int, or in this case it returns num. So you use the math method from the math class called math.random, and then the user, the integer a, it uses to put the maximum amount of numbers that it can generate. Sorry, the maximum value of the number it can generate. So let's say I want it to be from 0 to 8, for it to generate numbers from 0 to 8. So then I have to input 9 for my integer, because it's inclusive. It's exclusive, yes. And then it returns num. This is very, very useful. Next, we have another method called large int. So it takes an element from an array and sees if it's the largest or not. So it takes an integer array, and then it returns an int right there. So then you use a for loop for this, and an if statement, and then you return b, or the integer. And then the next method is called element counter, and it takes two things. It takes an integer, and then it takes an integer array, so an array of numbers. So you have the variable count right here, and then you use a for loop, and then within that for loop you use a conditional statement if. So yeah, and then it prints out count at the end right here. And it returns the amount of times the user's input appears, for element counter. And next we have another method called next prime. It takes an int, or int x, and then it returns an int right here. And then we use the past method we wrote all the way up here. We use, where is it? We use isPrime, because it's essentially the same thing, next prime. It sees if the next number is a prime or not. So I thought it was a better idea to use isPrime, which would be much more efficient rather than just write the whole code again, because it doesn't really make sense. So next prime is a much more advanced version than isPrime. So next we have print question 1, which I've used countless times in my game because I have arrays of math problems that I want to print out, and I was getting really sick of typing it all out, all I wanted to print. So then I made this method, and then it takes the questions from an array, so it takes the elements, and then it prints them out. So you see there's a char array called let, uses a scanner, it has a variable called input, and then it prints the first element, or element 0. And then it uses a for loop to print the rest. And then as well, it sees if the answer, because the last element in an array is usually the answer. So then it also tests, not only does it print it, it also tests whether the answer is correct or incorrect. So extremely useful. Then we have some J option pane methods. So this one's called turns J from string to int. So it's very self-explanatory. In J option pane, the user types in a string, and then it converts it to an int, and you use parseInt, the method. And then we have another one called jprint, which simply just, right where it says text, the user types in what he wants to print out, and it'll show up on a big box right here in the middle. It's not in the console. And then we have another J option pane one called jinput, and it takes a string, and then it just takes the input of the user right on a box will appear right on your computer, and it'll tell it whether it's correct or The user has to determine whether it's correct or incorrect. And then our last method, we have toChar array, which it takes a string and then it puts each letter in a new array of characters. So it's one array for all of them, but it puts like one character into one element, the next into another. And then it returns the array, or returns empty. So then we use word.length, and then we used another for loop, and then we used char at. So thank you, that was my tools class. I had lots of fun making it, and I think all these tools are really useful for me, and they'll be useful for me in the future.